Very first topic of today's discussion. This is with respect to India's corruption paradox, growth without trust. On 1st of January 2026, the Government of India, through the Press Information Bureau, came up with a particular notification saying that India has now surpassed the status of Japan as the fourth largest economy in the world. And this indeed is a proud moment for all of us. We know that India is one of the largest growing economies in the world. But I have a question for you. Does the economic growth automatically translate into good governance? That's a very important question. Because recently we have had the Corruption Perception Index report of 2025, which gives a rather uncomfortable picture. What you'll have to understand is that corruption in India has been a legacy issue. When we talk about post-independent, or even if you talk about the pre-independence time, the colonial times, or even in the Mughal era, and even Chanakya talks about corruption in his Arthashastra. So it has been a legacy issue. But what you'll have to understand is that it compromises the interest, especially of the vulnerable sections, and it retards the economic growth of a nation. So we need to find effective solutions. What this particular report says is, specifically once we talk about India, that we have very robust laws in place. We have digital models in place, digital instruments. But once it comes to the enforcement part, it's quite weak. Once it comes with respect to the institutional capacity, it's quite weak. So these are two very important areas, that is weak enforcement and weak institutional capacity. Very, very important topic, not just from the perspective of GS2, that is governance and transparency, but also with respect to GS3 development, GS4 ethics and governance. The kind of content we'll be discussing today can be used in any of these papers. It is going to be a comprehensive discussion. We would focus on each and every aspect of it. We'll first talk about the report itself. We'll talk about the global picture. And then we'll talk about in specific with regards to India. What is India's stature as far as this report is concerned? Then we'll talk about what are the challenges with respect to the corruption. What have been the silver lining, the positives? What are the consequences of corruption? And ultimately the way forward. So it's going to be a very comprehensive discussion. What you'll have to understand is, what the author says is that transparency must become a national priority. Very, very important column which has been published in the Hindu. Now, let's first talk about what do we mean by corruption. Dekhiye, anywhere, wherever there's a question with respect to the corruption, you can put this short and crisp definition. Corruption means the abuse of entrusted power. The power which is entrusted in a particular person, or the abuse of public office for personal gains. So what is corruption? It is the abuse of entrusted power or public office for personal gain. You can use this in ethics, in GS2, anywhere. Now, as I said, we have the corruption perception index. Dekhiye, yahan par ek word hai. There's one word which is perception. So understand, this index is a perception based index. What people feel with respect to corruption in that particular country or region, right? It's a perception-based survey. Now, this Corruption Perception Index, it is basically released by an international civil society organization known as Transparency International. The very objective of this particular organization is to make sure that we curb, or we basically strike at the very root of corruption. Bahut important hai. The headquarters of Transparency International are in Berlin, Germany. Remember that. Can be asked in the prelims. So right now I'll be talking about those points which probably from which a question can be framed in the prelims. Now, once you look at how we basically measure this particular aspect or the gravity of corruption in any of the country, we have a scale which is followed. Scale jo hai, it is from 0 to 100, where 100 is very clean and 0 is highly corrupt. ठीक है, 100 is very clean, we're talking about the scores, and 0 is highly corrupt. If you look at top 5 countries with minimal corruption, we have Denmark, we have Finland, we have Singapore, we have New Zealand, we have Norway. If you just look, most of these countries, Denmark, Finland, Norway, they are what we call as the Nordic countries, right? Or generally you also call them as Scandinavian countries, remember. Then we have the bottom 5, the countries performing the worst. we have Libya, we have Yemen, we have Venezuela, we have Somalia, we have South Sudan. ठीक है, तो ये याद रखिएगा. Now, the Corruption Perception Index ranks 182 countries and territories worldwide. Now, I've taken this snippet and this snippet from the Corruption Perception Index itself, right, from the report itself. Worldwide, by the perceived levels of public sector corruption. What is the level of corruption in the public sector? ठीक है. The results are given on a scale of 0, highly corrupt, to that of 100, very clean. While 31 countries have significantly reduced their corruption levels since 2012, the rest are failing to tackle the problem. They have stayed stagnant or got worse during the same period. The global average has fallen to a new low of 42. And this is again a very depressing news, a very negative news. Almost 122 countries out of 182 countries, they score less than 50. देखिए बोला भी है, it has also said this, while more than 2/3 of the countries score below 50. And people are paying the price. Ultimately, it is the people who pay the price. And we're not just talking about the general public. And this is a very important issue you'll have to understand. We are talking more about the vulnerable sections. Those who have less purchasing power. एक तो, at first instance, they have less purchasing power. And then they are also bearing the brunt of corruption. So there is a kind of a double burden. ठीक है? And people are paying the price as corruption leads to underfunded hospitals. We are talking about strengthening the social sector, strengthening the social infrastructure, schools, hospitals. But if a good amount of public fund is diverted so that the public officials can gain for their own personal gains, then that compromises the very efficiency or the very status of the social infrastructure in that particular country. ठीक है? Unbuilt flood defenses and blights the hopes and dreams of the young people. The anti-corruption leadership gap. This is also one of the very important points, because this highlights the fact that even in the developed countries, what we are witnessing is that there is lack of civic space. There is a suppression of dissenting voices. Those voices who are basically against corruption, their voices are being suppressed. ठीक है? We are seeing a concerning picture of the long-term decline in the leadership to tackle the corruption. Even established democracies like the US, UK, and the New Zealand are experiencing a drop in performance. The absence of bold leadership is leading to weaker standards and enforcement, lowering the ambition on anti-corruption efforts. Why I am telling all this is so that you can cite these things in your answers. ठीक है? Even in a country like US, what we are witnessing is democratic backsliding. You would say, sir, it is one of the oldest democracies. Yes, it is one of the oldest democracies. But what people are saying, people are now commenting that the activities or the actions of President Trump, the actions of the executive, they are not based on democratic principles. Arbitrary actions are being taken by the executive without the concurrence of the people. So that is what is known as democratic backsliding. ठीक है? Even in a country like US. So that is what you'll have to understand. And also there are allegations that there is huge corruption involved. For the US, we generally cite the word military industrial complexes. Military industrial complexes. Always remember, whenever there was a war earlier, or whenever there will be a war, it is going to be highly beneficial for the US, because US works on this principle of military industrial complexes. Why did it start the war? When we talk about the West Asia, because ultimately its economy is getting benefited. Look at the exchange rate we are witnessing with respect to dollars in India. So all other countries are at loss, but US is not at loss, because its industry, a major portion of its industry is basically dominated by the military industries. We have Boeing, we have Lockheed Martin, various companies who manufacture the defense platforms, right? What it also says is democracies score higher, 71 average, than authoritarian regimes. Institutional, and it signifies institutional strength controls the corruption. If you have strong institutions, then there would be greater oversight. And if there would be greater oversight, there would be lesser chances of corruption. Simple सी बात है, ठीक है? So this is what you'll have to understand. Now, let's come to India and see what has been the performance. India's performance: stagnation amid growth. We are witnessing one of the highest rates of growth, economic growth. But once we talk about our performance or our standard with respect to the corruption perception index, it has not improved. For almost one decade, we have been scoring around 38 to 43. That's it. Score has been stagnant from 38 to 41 over the last one decade. Despite becoming a major global economy, India's governance perception has not improved. And this is really concerning, because if your economic growth rate is increasing and if your performance with respect to corruption is not improving, then this puts a question mark. This puts the question mark. Why? Because the economic growth rate is then uneven. It is not equitably distributed among all sections of society. What we are trying to say is that the growth we are witnessing is highly unequal. It's unequitable, right? India performs better than Bangladesh and Pakistan, similar to Sri Lanka, and slightly below China. Okay. Now, if you look at this, we have scored 39 out of 100. Rank is 91 out of 182 countries. And this is the chart. Again, I've taken this from the report itself. Economic impact of corruption. What is the economic? According to the report, globally, if you look at the global picture, the economic cost of corruption at the global level is around 5% of GDP. 5% of global GDP. And it turns to almost $2.6 trillion. Okay, $2.6 trillion. With respect to India, the direct loss is almost 0.5% of GDP, and total impact, again, it is in the range of 1 to 1.5% of GDP. Just imagine, just for your comparative analysis, India spends cumulatively, we're talking about government as well as the private organizations, both cumulatively spend less than 0.65% of GDP on the research and development. 0.65% of GDP on research and development. Such an important area: artificial intelligence, cloud computing, quantum computing, biotechnology, nanotechnology, space. And the corruption, the cost which we have to bear because of the corruption, it turns to it's almost equivalent to 1.5% of GDP. That is a great loss. Okay? Now, there is one very important loss, one important factor, which the article talks about. The article basically gives one of the very important reasons for corruption in India. What it says is that there is one particular structural challenge. There is one of the biggest challenge, and that is complex compliance system. Complex compliance system. What the author, and I'll try to explain over here itself, and then we'll also talk about in the causes. What the author says is that the regulatory structure which we have in India, regulatory structure ka matlab, let's say a company wants to basically start a particular business. A person wants to start a business. Let's say e-commerce, or let's just want to start a manufacturing plant, or want to come up with a pharma unit, anything. He or she will have to follow a lot of cumbersome procedures, which are not really relevant. Okay? And because of this, because of the numerous compliances or regulatory burdens which are imposed on that particular person, this gives rise to or gives the scope of corruption. Because once you have so many laws, and what the author is saying is that there is criminal liability in all these rules and regulations. Okay? So it creates a feeling of fear in the minds of the people. It lowers the entrepreneurship ability. It lowers that particular innovative ability in the people, because people are scared. If they really want to start a business, they'll have to comply with so many things. This creates discretion with respect to the officials. What official says, don't worry, give us this amount, we'll get your papers ready. Because there are so many rules which are to be followed. There is red tapeism which is involved. Arbitrary clauses are to be followed. This also gives rise to the rent-seeking behavior. Because there is a discretion involved, so it gives rise to rent-seeking behavior. Understand? We'll also discuss in the causes part. But there are silver linings. There are good things. What are the positive developments? If we talk about India's structure, we have invested a lot in the digital governance, what we call as digital public infrastructure, DPI. For example, Aadhaar stack, India stack, what we call as, which includes the Aadhaar, Jan Dhan accounts, right? We have the Trinity, JAM Trinity, right? With Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and mobile, direct benefit transfers. So this, to a large extent, it has reduced the menace of corruption. We have the DBT, direct benefit transfer. What happens is it reduces the leakages. Previously, there were a lot of leakages involved. At every part of the supply chain, money is being transferred from the central government to that of the state and then to the local bodies and then finally in the hands of the beneficiaries. So there was a lot of siphoning of funds, pilferage of funds. But now, since the amount is being directly transferred, there is less leakage. Then we have digital payments. According to the RBI Digital Payments Index, the recently released report, what it says is that India is scoring more than 500. So what we see is that this reduces the intermediaries, because if you basically give importance or impetus to digital payments, it would reduce the number of those people, the middlemen, and that would definitely enhance the efficiency in the overall system, right? Then GST network, it leads to improved compliance, more formalization, reduced tax evasion. ठीक है, तो ये importance है. Then we have e-procurement systems. If you have e-procurement systems, it would give rise to foolproof mechanism, reduced discretion of the officials. Now the officials would have less discretionary powers because you have platforms. We have the government e-marketplace, GEM. We have the e-tendering which takes place. Various departments come with this e-tendering. So definitely in one way or the other, the digitization aspect has definitely helped to reduce or curb the menace of corruption. There is no doubt. But again, there are issues with respect to the enforcement. There are issues with respect to the institutional capacity. ये दो word हमेशा याद रखिएगा. Now, if we talk about corruption as an economic and strategic challenge, we have three important domains which are basically greatly affected by the menace of corruption. We have as corruption as the economic constraint. Why? Because just imagine a situation where you have corruption which is pervasive inside the system. It would lower down the competitiveness in the economy. It would lower down the efficiency in the economy. Because those who are powerful, corruption favors the powerful. Those who are already powerful, they would come in a nexus with the officials. So those people who do not have that capacity, who have just entered into the domain in the marketplace, they will not be able to compete with the strong players. So this would lower down innovation, lower down efficiency, lower down the competitiveness in the economy. I hope it is clear. Then the governance issues. It would lead to weak institutions. We have oversight institutions in the form of CVC, Central Vigilance Commission, CBI भी ले लो, Lokpal and Lokayuks. If you'll have more of corruption in the society, if you'll have weak institutions, people would develop a feeling of discontent, distrust towards the governance. Okay? And then that can lead to social upheavals. What happened in Nepal? What you call as the Gen Z protest. So it ultimately led to the collapse and many people died. If things would have been on the right track, this would not have taken place, right? Then we have strategic risk, affects the investor confidence. India as a country, it needs a lot of funds. What we talk about, that we need a lot of funds to basically develop various sectors, and that needs investors. But if investors would see that there is lots of corruption in this particular country, they would not be willing to invest in any domain. We would see lower foreign direct investments or even domestic investments. Maybe the people in India who have surplus capital, they would invest outside. So it leads to that particular strategic issues, right? For India, if we have set a goal of $10 trillion economy, what we'll have to focus and make sure is that governance reforms are kept in mind and they are followed, right? Now let's talk about the causes of corruption as identified in the report. And we are talking about at the global level also, and there are some causes which are related to India also. So you can just, wherever there's a question with respect to corruption, you can definitely cite all these points, very credible points. Weak justice and rule of law. What are the causes? The very first is weak justice and rule of law. What we have been witnessing is politicization of judiciary, politicization of judicial appointments. The executive is now playing a dominant role with respect to the judicial appointments. Judiciary, which is a bulwark of democratic freedom, which protects the democratic interest of the people, is now, its overall functioning is being compromised. There is quid pro quo which is involved. Very important terms. We have seen the retired judges of the Supreme Court. being given important positions. Let's take the case of former Chief Justice of India, Ranjan Gogoi. After his tenure as a CJI, he was made a Rajya Sabha member. And look at his performance in Rajya Sabha. Not a single question has been asked by him. So this is a quid pro quo. You do something for us right now, and after you retire, after you demit the office, we'll make sure that we do something for you in return. Okay? Then oversight bodies. The autonomy or the functioning of the oversight bodies has been suppressed. It is being curbed. More ministerial discretion is being exercised with respect to the functioning of these bodies. CVC, CBI. Why CBI is known as a caged parrot? The Supreme Court itself said in one of the cases that CBI is a caged parrot. It does what the government says. Mamata Banerjee, the Chief Minister of Bengal, has also said this many a times. So this compromises the very integrity of that particular office. If we have weak rule of law enforcement, and ultimately we have people who suffer. Okay? Then we talk about undue influence on political decision making. What about the political funding? The government came up with the electoral bonds. Later it was scrapped by the Supreme Court. Electoral bonds. Which party got the maximum benefit? So you may say that you are bringing a particular scheme which would usher in transparency, which would bring in transparency. But ultimately you are getting benefited. In fact, it is creating a kind of a wheel where everything is enclosed. No one is able to know that who is contributing how much to your party, right? Let's talk about the crony capitalism. What is crony capitalism? Where businesses are very closely related to the government. You very well know what is happening in India or even in other parts of the world, where the government's policies in one way or the other favor specific corporate houses. And ultimately it leads to what? Distrust in the minds of people. See, there is no harm in development. We are not saying that don't develop. But the things should be equitable. What one corporate is getting, the other players must also get. There has to be a level playing field as far as the corporate mechanism is concerned. But there is crony capitalism. Again, quid pro quo plays a very important role. Okay? Then we have shrinking civic spaces and media freedom. Investigative journalism. I'm again repeating. Investigative journalism is seeing a setback in India. We have had many cases. Investigative journalism also talk about the civic space. People who really want to raise the voice. Recent case of 2025, Mukesh Chandrakar in Chhattisgarh. He had a channel on the YouTube, I think the Bastar Junction. He was killed. He wanted to expose the corruption in the road construction. He was killed brutally. His body was found after so many days in a septic tank. So this is the issue. So there have been many people. Sandeep Kothari in 2015 was murdered, brutally murdered. So this, what it leads to is, what the governments of various countries are doing is they're increasing the surveillance. And this, in one way or the other, it is suppressing the journalistic or the investigative journalism. Suppressing the NGOs who are working in this particular domain. I'm not saying all the NGOs are very good. There are issues also with the NGO functioning. But because of this, what the government says is because of national security, we would curb the funding of the NGOs. And because of it, those NGOs which are really doing a great work, their autonomy is sacrificed. Then we have the violence, failure in public financial management. Public financial management, once we talk about the debt management, once we talk about the budgeting, you look at what is happening at the local level. There are funds which are given to the local bodies, but hardly we see the effective implementation of various projects. Water, sanitation, hygiene, building toilets. Toilets are made, again it's broken. Then the new tender comes. You must have seen in your cities. We have roads, then they are broken. Again a new road. After 2 years, again a new road. Because there is corruption involved. Everyone benefits, right? Failure, complex regulatory structures, as I already told you. We have numerous regulatory structures and compliances which are to be followed by the respective businesses. And this creates a burden. This creates a burden on that particular person who wants to start a business. So in the end, what that person, he's left with no choice. Ultimately, that person, what he says is, okay, you take the money and get the papers ready. And in many cases, what happens is, because of it, the industry does not work adequately with proper safeguards. Why we are witnessing a lot of industrial disasters? Because they do not have the adequate checks. Adequate checks were not done by the fire department or any other department, right? Social and cultural factors. Petty corruption in India has been normalized. Again repeating, petty corruption in India has been normalized. Most of the people, they don't have any problem with that. They give amounts, they give a specific amount to the person, the constable at the traffic lights, right? So if there is someone who has violated the traffic lights, what you see? In most of the cases, in almost 99% of the cases, there is a deal which is done. So we have normalized this particular thing. We do not feel bad about it. That's the problem, right? So we'll have to change the way we think. And there has to be a nudge. There has to be a social change, a behavioral change with respect to the aspect of corruption. Okay? Consequences kya hai? Ek bar dobara dekh lete hain. We have the cost of corruption on society, erosion of justice and human rights. Because if there is corruption involved, it would also compromise the merit. It would also lead to the extinguishment or the denial of rights with respect to the vulnerable sections. Human rights would be denied, right? Undermines the rule of law. Then democratic decline and state capture. If you'll have more of corruption in a society, it would lead to the capture of those institutions which are ensuring transparency. Judiciary, for instance. It would lead to the policy capture by the corporate houses. Okay? Power concentrated in the hands of the elite, and therefore only few people would decide the fate of the economy, not the others. Suppression of civic spaces and media. It stifles the free speech and dissent. We have seen people being killed. What happened? One more case. We had the case of the former IAS officer, Satyendra Dubey. He was killed brutally because he wanted to expose a corruption in the NHAI. Then we also have the case of S. Manjunath in 2005, I believe. He was a working officer in the Indian Oil Corporation and he wanted to expose the fuel adulteration. He was brutally killed. So if there's a perception which is created, a perception of fear, people would not come out and respond. This would lead to lower whistleblowers because people don't have the capacity. They don't feel secure that what if there is a threat involved with respect to their lives. Deterioration of public services and inequality. The fund which is ideally made for the social infrastructure, which is kept for building the social infrastructure, the schools, hospitals, is basically going in the pockets of the public officials. So this would lead to the lowering of human development indicators. Okay? Poor services and widening the wealth gap. Then broader societal and economic impacts, slows down development and fuels instability. Obviously, more corruption in the society would affect the productivity. Ultimately, it would affect the competitiveness and the economic growth. It would lower down the investor confidence and the whole economy would suffer. That is what you'll have to understand. It may benefit. In the short term, it may benefit some officials. But in the long term, we'll see that there is compromise with respect to the overall efficiency of the country, overall economic growth. What should be the way forward? What the report has basically recommended, the pathways. The very first is independent and transparent justice institutions. Those institutions who are in charge of adjudicating, of coming up with verdicts, those must be kept in isolation. There should not be arbitrary infringement in the functioning of those institutions, be it judicial appointments or the other things. Let's take a very good case, a very good example. We have Article 112, subclause 3, which talks about the charge expenditures. Those expenditures which are not voted by the parliament. Charge expenditure in order to ensure the independence and impartiality of the office, the salary and the pensions of the Supreme Court judges, administrative expenses, the pensions of the High Court judges, they're all charged on Consolidated Fund of India. What about Election Commission of India? The expenses of Election Commission of India are not charged on the Consolidated Fund. They're voted. Means what? Government has a very important role in deciding how the Election Commission would work. So for these bodies, what we should ideally, in fact, the Indrajit Gupta committee report also said that the expenses of the institutions like ECI, they must be charged. Similarly, the other institutions, tribunals, what we see in tribunals, most of the tribunals are dominated by the people of the government. And government is the most important litigant. So obviously, what would happen, you can imagine, right? tackle undue influence on political decision making. Even if you are coming up with different mechanisms to ensure transparency in electoral funding, for example, you came up with the electoral bonds, make sure that it is transparent. It should not cover a wheel that who is contributing how much. People should know. That is what you'll have to understand. Okay? Because if we see contributions made by specific corporate houses, the government would in one way or the other benefit those corporate houses. Okay? Foster civic space and anti-corruption reporting. We'll have to make sure that whatever investigative journalism we are having or whatever whistleblower mechanism we have, Whistleblower Act, it was enacted in 2014. To this day, it has not been implemented. So what kind of protection the whistleblower would expect? That person who knows about the corruption in his or her department and wants to expose. That is known as whistleblower. Okay? Transparency and oversight in financial management. We have different bodies. We have parliamentary mechanisms, question hour, 0 hour, parliamentary committees. We should give importance to that so that the executive can be made more accountable. CAG, Comptroller and Auditor General. There has to be an important role which should be played by the CAG. CAG is coming up with its work, but there is, as I said, there is weak institutional capacity. CAG comes up with a report almost after a decade the thing has happened. Right now, we are having the reports which are given by the CAG of those events which happened in 2016 and 17. This is like a post-mortem. Governments have already come and gone, right? Expand the digital governance. This is again very important. We have already invested a lot in DPI, digital public infrastructure, but we'll have to make sure that it is adequately utilized. What we are witnessing, and I was having a conversation with one of my friends who is in the revenue services. He said that even though there is a great digitization which has happened, but still at the roots, what we are finding is there is no effective implementation. People have come up with different ways and means to fill their pockets. So we'll have to make sure that there is end-to-end digitization, right? Strengthen the whistleblower protection. Again, so that people have this feeling. People can have the trust that, if I would come and expose this corruption which is happening in my department, I would be protected. There would not be any threat to my life, okay? Citizen participation and social accountability. Ultimately, what you'll have to understand is the civil society organizations, people at large, they must unite. We already saw what happened in 2013, India against corruption. We had Anna Hazare, we had Baba Ramdev and everyone, Arvind Kejriwal also, who joined those protests. So we need to basically make sure that citizens actively participate. And there should be no acceptance. Corruption should not be normalized, howsoever small. Even a 10 rupee note, that should not be normalized. And social accountability. What you can do is you can increase social audits. We had this in Manrega, now it has been scrapped. Social audits. Or increase technology, blockchain technology in public procurement. You can just quote it down. Enhancing the technological aspects. Social AI in auditing. Use artificial intelligence in auditing. So these technological integrations can also help. So what you'll have to understand is that corruption is a menace. It is a menace to the society, to the governance, and it is definitely compromising the overall well-being. Though we are one of the fastest growing economic powers in the world, but if this thing happens, if this thing continues, then we'll not see that the benefits are reaching to the lowest rung of the society. So we'll have to make sure that the benefits are equally distributed among various sections of society, and only then India would be able to achieve the very objective of Viksit Bharat by 2047. Okay, let's have a mains practice question. The Corruption Perception Index of 2025 highlights a persistent governance deficit in many emerging economies, including India. In this context, examine the causes and consequences of corruption in India. Also suggests a comprehensive way forward to address this particular issue. Believe me, this is a very important topic, and I've already told, not just from the perspective of GS2, but also GS4 and GS3. If you just go through the content, if you try to write an answer, this is definitely going to help you a lot. And yes, if you're liking the initiative, do not forget to press the like button and also let us know in the comment. Let's go to the next topic.